I should have realized trouble was brewing the moment Deputy Martinez rang me that morning. His voice carried that strained politeness people use when they're trying not to laugh while delivering bad news. He told me, and I quote, "We've got a situation at your place. There's a woman in head-to-toe camouflage, armed with a crossbow, attempting to take out your livestock." I asked him to repeat it because surely I'd misunderstood, but no, he confirmed it. The president of our HOA was dressed like she'd stepped out of a hunting catalog, complete with face paint and what looked suspiciously like a ghillie suit pieced together from fake turf samples. When I pulled up at my ranch, there was Margaret Blackwell, our illustrious HOA president and self-appointed defender of suburban purity, hunkered behind my tool shed. Leaves were taped to her designer yoga pants, and she was whispering into a walkie-talkie about hostiles breaching the perimeter. My cow, Bessie, stood 20 feet away, chewing cud with total indifference. Meanwhile, a neat trail of organic baby carrots led straight from Margaret's hiding spot to where Stanley, my goat, was blissfully snacking, oblivious to the fact that he'd been cast as the villain in Margaret's imaginary battlefield. Maybe I should back up. I'm Robert Mitchell Bob Tomost, and a retired vet tech who settled in Pine Ridge Estates 3 years ago. I bought the subdivision's last undeveloped 3-acre lot on the eastern edge precisely because it kept its agricultural zoning. The previous owner had fought hard to keep it that way when the developers came in, and I was grateful. These days, I've got 3 dairy cows, 2 goats, and a modest chicken flock, including a rooster named Colonel Sanders who feels it's his sacred duty to announce the dawn, and several times after, at 4:30 every morning. When I moved in, Margaret had already reigned as HOA president for 7 years. She wore pearls to every meeting, even emergency ones about clogged storm drains, and toted a leather-bound notebook she proudly called the neighborhood Bible. She enforced rules about everything from mailbox paint colors, beige to taupe, no exceptions, to the maximum height of decorative gnomes. 12 inches had included. Pine Ridge Estates was her kingdom, and she was not amused when someone set up an actual working ranch within sight of her throne. The campaign began with letters about 2 weeks after I moved in. "Dear Mr. Mitchell, your rooster's early morning crowing constitutes a noise violation under Section 12.4 of the bylaws. Immediate corrective action required." Then came the fence complaints. Split rail, apparently, was far too rustic. My scarecrow, classified as unauthorized yard decor. The compost pile, an illegal waste facility. She even filed a grievance that my cows were visible from the walking path, as though livestock were some kind of indecent exposure. When the letters didn't scare me off, she escalated to fines: $50 a day for unauthorized livestock, $75 for non-compliant fencing, and $100 for agricultural visual pollution, which, near as I could tell, meant she could spot my barn from her third-floor window if she squinted through binoculars. I fought each fine through official channels, pointing out my land's agricultural status predated the HOA itself. But Margaret had stacked the board with her loyalists. Every appeal was struck down in a 4-1 vote, with only Tom Bradley, the retired guy who kept bees in defiance of Section 8.9, standing with me. Margaret's war against my little ranch got more inventive once she moved from letters and fines to gossip. At HOA meetings, she spun wild tales. That I was secretly selling raw milk from the barn, that my goats were luring coyotes into Pine Ridge, never mind we hadn't seen a coyote since the golf course went in, and that my chicken coop was single-handedly slashing property values by 15%. She swore the figure came from a reputable analysis, though she never managed to produce so much as a pamphlet when pressed. Things took a darker turn when she launched what she grandly called a Neighborhood Action Committee to combat the supposed rural blight. She hosted gatherings in her living room, serving cucumber sandwiches with the crusts cut off, while giving PowerPoints about the dangers of agricultural encroachment. She even made bar graphs showing a correlation between cow ownership and crime rates, which, of course, was zero, but delivered it with theatrical gravitas. Soon there were glossy pamphlets with titles like Suburban Excellence versus Rural Decay and Protecting Our Children from Farm Animals. Margaret even retained legal counsel. Enter Bradley Stevens, a jittery young lawyer who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He pitched a plan to the board: rezone my parcel as recreational green space, which would outlaw livestock and leave me no choice but to sell or turn it into HOA-approved landscaping. To pass, the scheme needed 75% of homeowners' votes. Margaret threw herself into campaigning like she was running for Congress, knocking on doors, bringing baked goods, promising reduced fees, and warning that my ranch was only the beginning of a barnyard apocalypse she dubbed a barnyard dystopia. The vote was set for September's annual meeting. Margaret radiated confidence, even taunting me during her morning power walks. Dressed in velour tracksuits worth a family's grocery budget, she'd pause at my fence to remark how lovely the land would look as a park. She even unveiled landscaping sketches, walking past through my pasture, a meditation garden replacing my chicken coop. She smiled when she said it, but the kind of smile that makes you believe witches didn't come from fairy tales. 3 days before the big vote, Margaret decided legal maneuvering was too slow. That's when she went rogue. My trail cams caught everything. At 2:17 a.m., she arrived in what I can only describe as suburban commando gear. She'd purchased a hunting crossbow, receipt later entered as evidence, and apparently binge-watched YouTube tutorials on livestock management and tactical infiltration. She spent 45 minutes scaling my fence despite the gate being unlocked, ultimately tumbling headfirst into the compost heap. From there, the footage gets surreal. Crossbow raised, she crept toward the barn while narrating into her phone for documentation. She locked onto Bessie as her primary target, but because she hadn't strung the weapon correctly, the bolt plopped 3 feet in front of her. Switching tactics, she tried to corral the goats by hand. Stanley, my resident troublemaker, promptly chewed through her tactical vest while she wasn't looking. By dawn, the fiasco reached its finale. I found Margaret at 5:45 a.m., trapped inside the chicken coop. Somehow, in her zeal to gather evidence of unsanitary conditions, she'd managed to lock herself in. Colonel Sanders, my rooster, had perched triumphantly on her head, crowing like he was heralding a royal procession. She was caked in mud, feathers, and other natural byproducts I'll spare you the details of. When she saw me, she straightened as best she could, insisting this was an official HOA inspection. Hard to take seriously when you're holding a crossbow and sporting night vision goggles in broad daylight. After securing Margaret in the coop, my first call was to the sheriff's office. My second was to my daughter, Emma. She works in the FBI's cybercrime division, a detail I'd never shared with Margaret or the HOA because I prefer to keep family matters private. Emma happened to be visiting that weekend. When I filled her in, she told me to send over all the footage and every scrap of documentation I had on Margaret's crusade. She reviewed the files over her morning coffee, making the same thoughtful little humming sound she used to as a kid whenever she was piecing together a tricky puzzle. Then she smiled, set her cup down, and said she had a few calls to make to friends in other agencies who might find this case study entertaining. 72 hours later, Margaret's pristine suburban empire began collapsing. First came the federal agents at her door, asking why she'd slapped the USDA seal on her anti-ranch flyers. Turns out copying a government logo from the internet and using it in propaganda isn't just dishonest, it's a federal offense. The agents were especially intrigued by the way Margaret had meticulously filed her evidence in color-coded binders, complete with tabs for each so-called violation. But the rabbit hole went deeper. Investigators soon discovered that Margaret's husband, Dennis, had been illegally dumping landscaping debris from their business into the federally protected wetlands behind the golf course. The digital evidence was overwhelming. GPS truck logs, invoices, and even photo updates Dennis had proudly sent Margaret showing his progress at erasing the evidence. On top of that, questions popped up about their taxes, specifically the fact that Margaret had been paying herself an HOA president's salary without proper approval or paperwork. The real bombshell, though, was financial. Margaret had been siphoning HOA funds for years to bankroll her vendetta against me. Nearly $30,000 had gone into lawyers, consultants, and what she euphemistically labeled community research. In reality, those funds paid for a private investigator to shadow me, plus purchases like the crossbow, night vision goggles, and even a drone, which she promptly crashed into my barn during its maiden flight. Every shady expense was logged in the HOA system, because if nothing else, Margaret was religiously organized in her corruption. The special HOA meeting to address all this set an attendance record for Pine Ridge. The room was packed to standing room only, and someone had even brought popcorn, which felt fitting given the spectacle about to unfold. Emma delivered the presentation. She titled it When HOA Authority Goes Wrong, Case Study in Suburban Overreach. In the same calm, methodical style she used in federal court, she laid out evidence of trespassing, attempted animal cruelty, misuse of federal insignia, embezzlement, and, as she put it, conspiracy to deprive a citizen of lawful use of property. Margaret tried to cut in more than once, but Emma had come prepared. With a click of the remote, she projected the trail cam footage onto the same screen normally reserved for landscaping budget pie charts. There was Margaret in her turf-sample ghillie suit, clumsily aiming a crossbow at Bessie. Then came the footage of her trapped in the chicken coop while Colonel Sanders delivered a crowing tirade from atop her head. The audience gasped, then chuckled, then struggled to hold back full laughter. And when Emma replayed the slow-motion clip of Margaret tumbling into my compost heap, someone actually broke into applause before sheepishly stopping. The vote to oust Margaret from the HOA board wasn't even close. Every single hand went up. Even her most loyal allies couldn't find a way to spin the crossbow fiasco. In the same session, the board dropped all the bogus fines against me and formally acknowledged the agricultural exemption that had been there all along. Tom Bradley, the beekeeper and lone voice of reason during Margaret's reign, was chosen as interim president. His first act was to introduce a resolution protecting all pre-existing property rights from HOA interference. It passed unanimously, though that might have had less to do with principle and more with the image of Margaret dripping with chicken droppings on a 60-inch projector still burned into everyone's minds. The legal hammer dropped soon after. Margaret was charged with misuse of a federal insignia, trespassing, attempted animal cruelty, and embezzling exactly $28,743 from HOA funds. The county prosecutor, who clearly relished the chance to tackle something spicier than traffic violations, added harassment, false reporting, and conspiracy to commit fraud tied to her rezoning stunt. Her new lawyer, an expensive city attorney, not the skittish Bradley Stevens who had wisely fled the scene, argued that Margaret's actions were driven by a noble desire to protect property values. The judge was unmoved, especially after watching the video of her fumbling with a crossbow in a fake ghillie suit. In the end, Margaret was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years probation. She was also ordered to pay back $35,000 to the HOA, plus another $12,000 to cover my legal costs. As the sentence was read, her expression flickered from disbelief to fury to the desperate calculation of someone wondering if a last-minute insanity plea might work. She even blurted out that this was discrimination against people who care about property values, which, unsurprisingly, did nothing to soften the judge's stance.